Hi, I'm Connie Ozawa. I'm the director of the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning, and welcome to CityWise. For those of you who may not know, CityWise was started 4 years ago, so that we're in our 5th year, and it basically was created or conceived to be an opportunity for faculty at the Toulon School to share with our community the research topics of interest and what we've been working on, and to not just present ideas to you, but actually to initiate a conversation. So welcome. We hope that you'll enjoy this morning's presentation and have much to say back to our presenter, Dr. Jason Jurjevich. So this morning, I'm very happy to present our speaker, Dr. Jason Jurjevich. Jason has a PhD in geography from the University of Arizona. He joined the faculty in 2010 when he came to serve as assistant director of the Population Research Center at the Toulon School, or sorry, at the College of Urban and Public Affairs. Jason's research interests include an independent agenda beyond his work with the Population Research Center, and some of you may be familiar with his work with a colleague, Dr. Greg Schrock, on challenging Portlandia's thesis, the TV show Portlandia. And their research on who comes to Portland, who the migrants are, has made it to the New York Times and other places, so we're very proud of the work they've done. But this morning, Jason's going to present to you on another topic that he's been researching. And basically, it's about the use of census material and the way that the US Census categorizes different groups of people, and what are the consequences of these methodological tools. So without further remarks, I'd like to present Dr. Jason Jurjevich. Jason?
Good morning. Thanks for everybody for being here. I must confess I was getting ready this morning and got up earlier than usual and called my mom back in the Midwest, and she said, "What are you doing up so early?" I said, "I've got a talk at 7:30 about census data." She said, "You know how to have a good time." I said, "Thanks, Mom. I really appreciate that." I'm very excited, actually. I've been wanting to do this talk since I arrived in Portland, and I've really excited to have folks here from across the city, Cascade AIDS Project, Multnomah County, Lewis and Clark, the Q Center here in Portland, to really give you, as well as the Q Center on campus, really give you a conversation and some talking points by having a conversation about same-sex demographics from the census. Some of the work that, and just to contextualize this, some of the work that we do at the Population Research Center, there's a project that I'm working on right now for the Urban League, which is the state of Black Oregon. And so what we try to do, obviously, is use census data as a way to tell stories. Tell stories about communities that are here in Portland, tell stories about communities that are across the state. We use census data to make forecasts and also contextualize what's happening across the state. So my colleague Sheila Martin, along with Elizabeth Moorhead, recently published a study looking at self-sufficiency of Oregon families. And so recognizing that the traditional metric of poverty that the US Census Bureau defined back in the 60s has pitfalls with respect to the fact that the data that are used with respect to poverty do not consider, are not adjusted for geographic location. Poverty doesn't consider the costs of raising children, healthcare costs. So coming up with a metric that's able to sort of contextualize what American families are going through and families here in Oregon is one of the goals of this report. Evaluation, guiding policy, using data to do these things. We recognize that data is exceptionally powerful in being able to sort of help us through these things. But one of the things that that data that we're very careful of at the Population Research Center and the Coalition of the Communities of Color and Ann Curry Stevens has done is really be critical of data and really have a conversation about what data is not telling us and recognizing the limitations of data. So the work that we've done for the state of Black Oregon, for example, recognizing that not everybody is counted in data. There are undercounts of particular populations, disproportionate to communities of color, disproportionate in terms of not counting everybody in urban areas. And so for the State of Black Oregon report, recognizing that the majority of African Americans in Oregon, and particularly in Portland, identify as more than African American alone. They're African American and some other race. So when we start to have a conversation about what our communities look like, we want to make sure that we're being as critical and as thorough with respect to the data as possible. But one of the things that I haven't had a conversation about with a lot of my community partners are the limitations of census data with respect to the gay and lesbian population. And so I want to take you through the story today of how these data are being used, how you may see them in popular press, how they've been written up, and what the limitations of those data are, and then have a conversation with you about how we move forward here in Portland and Oregon to better understand the LGBT community. And so that's really the starting point for this. So the story begins here, which is in the 1970s. 1970s sociologists started to notice a couple of things that piqued their interest: changes in family structure, challenges to traditional gender norms, dual income households, increasing education rates among women. And in particular, there was two additional things that sociologists began to become interested in: the decline in the number of people who were marrying, which has been consistently declining since that period, as well as the increase in cohabitation, particularly among opposite-sex couples. So as a result of this, the opposite-sex couples who were choosing to live together, the Census Bureau decided that they were going to try to get data on these couples. And so the acronym, and the census loves an acronym, the acronym they used is POSSLQ. Persons of opposite sex who are sharing living quarters. And so in the late 70s, this was really starting to change with respect to the number of POSSLQs that were out in the United States, and the census wanted to get data on the POSSLQ population. So Charles Osgood wrote a poem about POSSLQs. Come live with me and be my love, and we will some new pleasures prove of golden sands and crystal books with silken lines and silver hooks. There's nothing I wouldn't do if you wouldn't be my POSSLQ. And on and on and on. So this is really the starting point for a direction to the Census Bureau to say, we want to collect data on this population. And so what the Census Bureau ended up doing was in 1990, they added a question, they added a box to the census form that would be collecting data on POSSLQs. So if you live with more than one person in your household, the Census Bureau is interested in knowing what relationship of person 2 is to person 1. So person 1 fills out the form, and it says, how is person 2 related to person 1? The addition that the Census Bureau made was that they added a classification called unmarried-partner. And that's how the census defines it to the right: a person who is not related to the householder, who shares living expenses, and who has a close personal relationship with the householder, as opposed to a housemate or roommate who's not related to the householder and who shares living quarters in order to primarily share expenses. Just rolls off the tongue, right? The unintended consequence of this new box, this new option for people to identify, was that people of the same sex, male, male, female, female, were checking unmarried partner to designate the relationship. The Census Bureau was very much stymied when the data came back because they had a couple 100,000 people, male, male, female, female, that checked unmarried partner. Now, the story is actually in the early 1990s, after they were processing the data, they felt that people must have done that in error, so they changed the gender of the respondents and moved them from same-sex couples to heterosexual couples. Years later, they ended up fixing that and going back to the original response. But this was really the genesis of what we're talking about with respect to data about same-sex couples that goes back to 1990. So data on same-sex demographics before 1990, obviously early research by Kinsey back in the 40s, late 40s, early 50s, finding that approximately the 10% threshold, right? Studying gay men, finding that 10%, studying men, finding that approximately 10% of them were, quote, predominantly homosexual. And that's where the 10% figure comes from. More recently, Lawman and some other folks have looked at this and basically tried to contextualize attraction versus behavior versus identity. Seeing what percentage of people will admit to being attracted to somebody of the same sex versus somebody who's actually, what their behavior is versus identity, and how that varies based on socioeconomic status, how that varies based on geography, how that varies based on gender. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple slides. But the vast majority of research and data that we have for the gay and lesbian population prior to census was actually from surveys. So there's a couple of surveys out there, that Health and Social Survey, Behavioral Risk Factor Survey, National Survey of Family Growth, and the General Social Survey. And you'll know that just in these ends here, the surveys tend to be relatively small. And so the challenge has been that there's issues with respect to generalizing the trends of the gay and lesbian population at smaller geographies, right? If you have a survey, the General Social Survey of 1,500 nationwide, it's tough to break out Oregon or break out Portland or cross-tabulate by educational attainment or by socioeconomic characteristics to say something meaningful about the population. So as a result of that, when the census data came along, there was really striking interest with respect to the fact that we had a census, right, of everybody in the United States and what the relationship was. And so as a result of that, a lot of the analysis moved away from the surveys and started to rely on census data as the primary mechanism and data source for telling the story. So since then, the census data has been used as the primary data to focus on demographics of gays and lesbians in the United States. And if you look through these data and these reports, you'll see that there's a couple of focuses that, that the scholarship tries to focus on. Wanting to describe the gay and lesbian population, wanting to characterize the gay and lesbian population, map, understand, and dispel stereotypes. Those are the chief and primary aims of a lot of the research that's relying on census data in terms of addressing the gay and lesbian population. And so a number of scholars have commented about the availability of census data and what census data have done in terms of providing contextual basis for LGBT families across the country and really having data around providing and telling the story for this population. So broadly, and again, this literature is very broad. I'm going to try to summarize it in as quickly as I can. The focus of the gay and lesbian population in terms of using census data has been particularly around urban geography and economic development. So understanding where the gay and lesbian population is in the late 70s and early 80s in terms of gentrification of American cities with respect to a deindustrializing base as first wave gentrifiers. And my colleague Cy Adler actually wrote an article in the early 90s that was focused on some of the work that Manuel Castells had done in the early 80s with a book called The City and the Grassroots. Manuel Castells was looking at the gay male population in San Francisco, and Cy's work focused on lesbian population in Portland. What's interesting about both of them is they follow a general methodology with respect to the data, and that census data wasn't available at this time. So the data that they used, both Castells and Adler, with respect to gay men and lesbians, I find particularly interesting, looking at key informants from the gay and lesbian community, looking at the percentage of same-sex households in terms of voting, looking at gay bars, gay businesses, locations, physical locations of the establishments. And for Castells, looking at the percentage of vote for Commissioner Harvey Milk, right? Those were the proxies that were used primarily before we had data from the census. And once that data became available, there was a fundamental pivot with respect to relying on census data as the primary data source with respect to the population. Focus on demographic marketing, knowing where gays and lesbians are with respect to recognizing them as an important consumer constituency. Work that Richard Florida's done around the creative class, which I'll talk about a little more in a second. Public policy, political awareness. So there's been a lot of work on domestic partner benefits, domestic partner protection, protection for gender identity, protection for housing and employment. And so having data to be able to gauge that has been a lot of work done on that. Public health and epidemiology, which is inferences that I find very problematic, actually, which I can talk about a little bit later. Effects of wage discrimination. Looking at differences with respect to wage, and again, I'll talk about that a little bit later. Geographic distribution and household relationship of the population. So for me, the story begins here. This is where I got interested in the data. In the early 2000s, Richard Florida's creative class thesis really picked up steam across the country. And when I was reading through the book, I looked at the fact that Richard Florida had developed a thing called the Gay Index. Okay? And so this is based on 1990 and 2000 census data. And you can see that the gayest city in the country, according to Florida's Gay Index, is San Francisco. And here, interestingly, Portland is number 10. And so again, this is based on the census data that is being reported in terms of developing this Gay Index. And so why Florida was so interested with respect to the Gay Index is his creative class theory, if you recall, I know a lot of you are familiar with this, is talent in terms of the creative class is attracted to tolerance. People want to live in tolerant and diverse places. They want to live in open and welcoming places. And so when he tested different metrics with respect to tolerance, he looked at three things: a Bohemian index, a foreign-born index, and a gay index. Okay? Problems set aside, I'm just marching through this to show you this. He found that the Gay Index correlated with economic development in terms of growth of businesses in the largest metro areas out of those top three indices. And so what he started to talk about was places that were open, welcoming to gays and lesbians, on balance, did better economically in terms of attracting well-educated workers in the knowledge and information economy, right? That's sort of the basic crucible of what he was talking about. So really, after Florida's work, there's been a lot of focus on where gays and lesbians live, how many people there are, what states do they live in. So these are just a couple of clippings that I've found, and I have literally hundreds of these states that have large populations of people of same sex who are living together versus those that don't. And there's a clip out of The Economist. But then you get really sort of what I find really weird maps that this is really literally just a month old from the Washington Post. Now that marriage is legal and same-sex marriage is legal in 36 states, South Dakota yesterday being the newest state. This map shows states that allow gay marriage that have above average gay population. Right? So this is looking at the number of people who identify in these places relative to the national average. And so Oregon tends to have, according to this map, an above average gay population, where you can see the vast majority of the country in the tan and dark tan color have below average gay population. Right? I don't think it's any coincidence, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second through this presentation, that that's strongly related to employment and housing protection. right? In a vast majority of states across this country, you can still be denied housing for being gay. You can be fired from your job for being gay. And so when we start to think about who are the people that are going to self-identify as same-sex couples and check the unmarried partner box, there is a high degree of selectivity in terms of who's going to do that and where they're going to do it in terms of where they live. So it's really about the geography of the closet, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple slides. So a good friend of mine has written an article about this, and so I'm citing him here, Jason Cianciato, who's now at the Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City. And he wrote an article for the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force in 2005 when he started to say, this is the best data source, but it doesn't count a lot of people. And so having a conversation about who's not in these data, I think, is really important. So the data that we're using from the census doesn't count single people, right? So if you're living by yourself, you can't be identified because there's not another person in the household for you to be put into the data. So by excluding single people, they're not included in these data, all right? Same-sex relationship, not living together. That's me. My husband lives in Washington, D.C. I live here. So when we fill out our census forms, there's no question, there's no way for us to identify as person 2 and person 1 because we're both person 1, right? Youth living with parents. So that's another group that's excluded from these data. Seniors living with children. The homeless population. We know that there's a significant undercount of homeless in census data. And again, homeless people not included in these data. Undocumented immigrants, which is another conversation around undercount, are also excluded from these data. And closeted individuals, individuals that are not going to self-identify as being an unmarried partner living with the same-sex partner. So as you might imagine, when we start to think about this and excluding these populations from these data, it really highlights the problematic nature of the data that we're pulling from the census by not including these people. What's more is there's been a lot of research on why people do not identify on the form. And so there's been a couple of studies on this, both Rudolph and Walther. 25% of people don't identify because of issues of confidentiality, right? So really talking about people who live in a place or in a situation where they don't feel comfortable telling the Census Bureau and the federal government what the relationship status is. And so what's interesting about this is when you start to look through some of these studies is the fact that there's little recognition of the pervasiveness and the fact that the pervasiveness and the significance of the closet. Certainly, the LGBT community has made remarkable progress with respect to the past couple years with respect to marriage equality, but the closet is a fundamental challenge in terms of people coming out and being able to identify as they are. 33% because they preferred other terms. 33% were offended by the lack of options or a lack of question about sexual orientation. Because we're not actually asking people what their sexual orientation is, we're simply asking what their behavior is. Then there's the process of inferring identity from behavior. Behavior assumes the process of labeling others, where identity involves the process of self-labeling or self-identifying. There's no question that's asking people how they identify on the census. It's assuming what their identity is based on the behavior. Self-identifying as an unmarried same-sex partner is strongly linked to race, class, and geographic factors. The propensity to identify and check this box is strongly linked to these three things. I'm going to go to this graphic here. So this is that Lawman article that I was talking about earlier. She's done research around people who have had same-sex partners since puberty, desire, attraction, and appeal for same-sex partners, and then those who actually identify as homosexual or bisexual. And you can see that there's strong variance with respect to race. There's strong variance with respect to urban cores versus rural areas. And there's strong variance based on educational attainment. And if you look at this, college graduates, just for example, 12% of the sample that she looked at had same-sex partners among men, 7% for women. But then you look at how many actually identify as gay or lesbian, it's roughly 3 to 4%. Among African Americans, same-sex partners, 8% have had same-sex partners. Same-sex women is 2.8%. But again, the identity in terms of those that are identifying as homosexual or bisexual is significantly less in terms of looking at those differences. So this is really important because when you start to look at and break apart the data demographically of who's identifying as an unmarried partner, you start to see the differences of these things fall out with respect to the data. I skipped over this last slide, which is the non-representativeness of this sample introduces bias, right? Because same-sex partnered households represent an extremely small percentage of the population, there are serious implications if this assumption is violated. If we're only taking a sample of a sample, and that sample is really small and it's not representative, there's significant limitations to the data, right? And let me just show you. This is a couple of things going on here. 1990, again, was the first year. This is when we had approximately 150,000 people identify as same-sex partners. In 2000 census, it jumped to almost 600,000. Okay? The green bars are American Community Survey data. So this is intercensal data that comes from the census every year. 2010 is coded in blue. That's another census year. And in 2013, I coded that red because it's the first year that the census decided it was going to break out those who were identifying as unmarried versus married. So before, in 2012, if you were legally married in a state, you were reclassified as unmarried because of the Defense of Marriage Act. Once the Defense of Marriage Act fell, and the federal government had the basis of allowed the federal government to recognize same-sex marriage in states where it was legal, the Census Bureau decided to report those statistics. So roughly, we're talking about 600 to 700,000 households across the United States that are identifying as same-sex partners. And you can see this line graph shows the percentage. It's roughly 0.6% of all households. We're talking about a really small number of people who are identifying as same-sex households. And here's another graphic that shows you this. 55 million married opposite-sex couples in the United States, 6 million unmarried opposite-sex couples, and then 400,000 unmarried same-sex couples, 250,000 married same-sex couples. As a percentage, it's really small. And so as a result of this percentage of people who are identifying as coupled same-sex partners, there's many limitations to these data. So if you take the data, if you take this 0.8 and the 0.4%, and you start to cross-tabulate the data, you get sort of bizarre things that look like this. Educational attainment by relationship status, these are 2013 statistics. Householder has at least one bachelor's degree. Look at the same-sex males and same-sex females. Anywhere from 45 to 50% of people who are identifying as same-sex partners that are male or female have a bachelor's degree, much higher than unmarried heterosexuals. I'm sorry, yeah, married and unmarried heterosexuals. Both partners with a bachelor's degree, 30%. Again, much higher than married opposite sex and unmarried opposite sex. So these statistics are suggesting that there's a degree of selectivity in terms of those who are more educated are more likely to identify as same-sex partners. And it reinforces stereotypes, right? With respect to gays and lesbians being more educated, having more money, right? And it actually, when we look at income, it does the same thing, right? Education and income being highly correlated. Look at the percentage of males, same-sex males and females that are making $100,000 or more. 35% of same-sex female partners, 45% of same-sex male partners identifying on the census make $100,000 or more. Why this is problematic is reinforcing stereotypes, but it also goes against data and research, particularly Mary Badgett has done work when she uses GSS data, the General Social Survey data. She finds actually that gay men earn 27% less than straight men. And lesbian women earn, on average, similar to their straight counterparts, slightly less. But if you look at these data, it's telling a completely opposite story. So when we use a representative sample, the narrative is very different than if we don't use the representative sample. Another thing that when we talk about a relatively small percentage of the population, I took the 5-year ACS data, so this is 2009 through 2013, and I mapped the percentage of couples by county. So the highest percentages in Oregon are in Benton, Lane, OSU, U of O, right? Jefferson, Multnomah. And there's no same-sex couples in Gillum, Wheeler, Crook, Lake, and Baker. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because when we do research at the Population Research Center, and when I talk to this about students, when we use ACS data contain a margin of error. So literally, in Baker County, it's 0 plus or minus 19. Right? There's 0 same-sex couples. There could be as many as negative 19. Not really, but if you read that statistic, that would be the way. When we look at margin of error relative to the estimate, when we do this work for clients, we create a red, green, yellow light scenario, which is simply if the estimate and the margin of error is, the relationship is low, like if it's 100 plus or minus 1, it's green light. It means the estimate's good. If it's yellow, it means proceed with caution. Red, the error in the estimate are not very good for interpreting or relying on these things. Here is the coefficient of variation, which tells you a degree of reliability in the data. And you can see that the vast majority of the state, this coefficient of variation is 0 to 15. But in Benton and Lane, for example, even though they have a high percentage of population, according to the estimate that are identifying as same-sex couples, the error relative to the estimate is somewhat high at 15 to 40% for the coefficient of variation. So we don't have a high degree of reliability that estimate is one to rely on in making interpretations from. And I've talked to Census Bureau officials about this, and one of my friends at the Census Bureau told me, when the error approaches half the estimate, i.e. it's yellow or red, it's better to round file the numbers than write a story about them. It's a brilliant quote. But there's been a lot of stories written about these data, and so that's the problem that I'm trying to highlight. One of the main focuses of these data that got a lot of attention is an actual book called The Gay and Lesbian Atlas. And it was done in the early 2000s by Gary Gates at the Williams Institute at UCLA. And so he mapped not only the percentages of same-sex couples by state, he mapped it by county, and actually decided to also map it by census tract. Again, census tracts have between 4,000 and 6,000 people in them. So mapping it by census tract really started to parse out the numbers at a really small geography. And I don't have time to talk about this in this talk, but there's a lot of critiques about Gates's work. I'd say probably most well-known is Michael Brown at the University of Washington, who has written a number of books around a book called Closet Space, and another article focus solely on this atlas, addressing this approach through a very theoretical critique, looking at a sort of a Foucauldian analysis of this. So if you're interested in the theoretical critiques of this, there's a whole body of literature that addresses this. But I sort of want to wrap things up and allow some time for conversation about thinking about this. Is some of the work that has been done also actually shows counties across the country where there's no gay and lesbians. And I don't really think this is hyperbole, but I really fundamentally believe that there's a discursive violence to doing that. That we're identifying counties across the country where we're saying there are no gays and lesbians. And so one of the, again, this could be a whole other conversation, but there was a brilliant piece that was done on CNN that I just want to play a clip where an opinion writer picks a county with 0 gay people and goes to the county and tries to find gay people. So the county he picks is Franklin County, Mississippi, which according to census data has 0 gay people. So I want to flip over to that and just show you this clip.
The gayness runs in our blood, hereditary. You got 2 cousins that were gay, and you never told me that.
2 out of a million.
But you never told me about it.
I don't know, I never thought about it.
In Franklin County, Mississippi, gay people don't exist, at least not on paper. Franklin is a rural county in southwest Mississippi with about 8,000 people. There are only 3 small towns, Bude, Meadville, and Roxy, and basically one highway that links them together. Oh, and one more thing. There are 0 same-sex couples, at least according to one analysis of census data done by UCLA. As part of a CNN op-ed project, I recently ranked the hospitality state as one of the least hospitable for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Since gay people aren't listed on paper, a videographer and I drove here to see if that's really the case. I had a few questions on my mind. Can there really be an all-straight county? What would that be like? And if there are gay people here, why are they invisible?
One of the reasons that brought us here was a census figure from 2010. One of the things that stuck out about Franklin County was that there were 0 same-sex couples in Franklin County. I wonder if you think that's true or what you think about that issue.
I don't know about that.
Have you ever known any gay people?
Oh, yeah. Right.
Here in this county?
Right.
Can you tell me about them?
Well, I'd rather not.
I wouldn't do that for, because of them, and, I don't have that right.
Can I leave my number with you?
Yes.
Okay, I'll do that. Well, thank you so much for telling us about it.
You're
Really
welcome.
appreciate it. Nice to meet you.
None of those people ever called me back, so I had to keep talking to people across the county without much luck. Eventually, I decided to pull into one last business, a hair salon in Meadville, where I found Jennifer Whitehead. She's a transplant from Ohio who, to my surprise, was willing to talk to me about her openly gay clients.
I know one of my clients is just bought their first house together, so.
Does she talk with you openly about those things, or is it?
Oh, yeah.
You just hear it around? Oh, you do? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I know, I do both of their hair, so.
Okay. You consider them friends?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I do.
Well, cool.
Definitely.
A few minutes later, just down the road, Jennifer took me to meet her friends.
Thanks again, Jennifer. Really nice to meet you. Take care. Hi.
Kristen Lovett and Bobby Jones live only a block or 2 from the main intersection in Meadville. I asked them about the statistic that says they don't exist.
No, it's not true, but it is close. I mean, us and I only know one other couple that is open and out with their relationship. Honestly, though, we haven't had trouble. I mean, my mother, she loves me, she supports me, we're getting married, she's gonna be at the wedding. But, no kissing in front of her. You don't want to take it to that next level, just out of respect for her.
That's so interesting. So, but you still, when you described it the first time, you said she really accepts you.
She loves me and she supports me. She's never disowned me. You know, I've known gay people whose families have completely disowned them. You know, she just asked that we just don't rub it in her face as far as kissing and stuff like that. We respect.
On the other hand, I don't care. Yeah, and I think it has a lot to do with personality. Like, I don't care what you think or she thinks or the neighbor thinks. I don't care.
Two totally different personalities sitting here. Big time.
On the surface, it seems like Kristen and Bobby are doing just fine. But it also became clear that it's difficult for them to be openly gay and living here. Take their marriage. While it's real to them, it's not legal in the state. It's the same with their family. They tolerate their lifestyle, they include them in family gatherings, but they don't really accept them for who they are.
Thanks so much for letting us come by.
You got it? Y'all in for a treat.
Get ready.
The more time I spent in Franklin County, the more I realized it's not necessarily gay people who are intentionally hiding. It's the culture here that's pushing them into the closet. And here's the thing. There are lots of gay people in Franklin County, and I tried to meet as many of them as I could. There are people like Robin, a veteran and student who keeps to herself up on a hill in part because she doesn't want to cause trouble for her daughter. Or John, the artist, whose real name I'm not using. People here know he's slept with men in the past, but he's trying to distance himself from that in part because of his religious views. And Nikki Jones and Christina Gibbs, another out couple who I met through Kristen and Bobby. They've been harassed because of their sexual orientation. They have a security camera on their porch, and they told me one of their neighbors sprinkled roofing tax on their driveway to try to pop their tires.
Good morning! So says a lot in terms of a lot of things versus what I could say. But I think it underscores the fact that that when we start to think about census data and census data reifying the fact that there are places in this country where, according to the data, that gays and lesbians don't exist, how problematic that is, and really underscoring the fact that the data really aren't addressing the complex phenomenon of the closet, right? And Michael Brown has written quite extensively about this, talking about the complexity of it as a spatial phenomenon. And another friend of mine has written about this, Scott Whitlock, pointing out that, quote, the challenges of understanding the closet with respect to agency and structure and spatial assumptions of identity is exceptionally difficult to understand. So I can't help but think about, and I know a lot of my colleagues in the LGBT community deal with this on a regular basis, but even being out here in Portland, being out at the university, and traveling back to Washington, D.C., and my husband being in the military, I'm always forced back in the closet when I go to D.C. Because he was in the military when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was put into effect in 1995, and he chooses not to talk about our relationship at work. And so what that's like for members of the LGBT community, how difficult that is, that even if you're out in one place, and depending on the spatial implications or the temporal implications of where you are, you may be forced back into the closet at another location. And how that translates into when you get the census form and your likelihood to fill it out, particularly when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in effect. There's no way I would have checked that box when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in effect and we were living in the same place. And so having a voice for people who don't have these protections and recognizing the limitations of the data not representing them, I think is a really important point here. So a couple of things. I want to wrap up with this, which is simply to get you thinking about, there's a division within the community, the LGBT community, about how we move forward with respect to these data. So this quote here, members of the gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community are left out of these data. The largest omission is single gay men and lesbians, who form a majority of the community. Since of only about a quarter of gay men and 2/5 of lesbians are coupled at any time, over half of gay and lesbians in the United States are not included in counting same-sex couples. So there's a recognition that the data are limiting. However, assumptions about people are flimsy. Numbers are solid. The reality of our political system is you don't really count unless you are counted. So if it's time to start believing an old estimate and start making an accurate count. So there's a recognition among scholars that the numbers are problematic, but the numbers are the best thing we have, so we should proceed with the numbers that we have and attempt to make them better. Right? That's sort of one perspective. And you may have seen this in Census 2010. This was a move by the Gay and Lesbian Task Force to ask people of the LGBT community to take this sticker and stick it to the back of their census form as a way to tell the Census Bureau in DC, add a question about sexual orientation. And so that's the perspective of we need to count, we need to be counted. Counter that with this quote, which is at the other end of the spectrum within the community. The information gathered in census will be a coup to big gay organizations that insist on painting gay and lesbian people as suburbanites in happy marriage-like relationships, driving their 2.4 children around in minivans. The word just like you, distortion, does nothing to counter the real problems of discrimination, violence, and health, the burden of which is disproportionately carried by those who do not look like or do not share the values of mainstream America. So this is a real fundamental divide within the community about how we proceed, how we go forward with respect to these data. So I will tell you some good news is the Census Bureau has a national advisory committee, which is a group of members, and I find this, maybe I'm just being overly critical here, but the committee, which is comprised of 32 members from multiple disciplines, advises the Bureau on topics such as housing, youth, poverty, privacy, race, and ethnicity, as well as gay, lesbian, transgender, and other populations. I guess I was thinking about a different quote that was problematic, but it was othering the LGBT population. One of the things that the committee has found is that if you remember the previous form, unmarried partner was actually put off to the side. And they're testing this form in 2020, which will move same-sex partners to opposite-sex partners within the same area of the form. So they've found that they've done pilot work and focus groups around these issues to attempt to address some of these issues with respect to identity in the form. So final thoughts is locally, the Urban League and the PFLAG, PDX Black Chapter, Parents, Friends of Lesbians and Gays, did a 2012 survey where they looked at a population of 200, and they talked about the experiences of LGBT people of color in Portland, in the metro, and put out a policy brief about this population and made a number of important recommendations to Multnomah County Health, to the city, about actually doing a better job of asking about sexual identity on data that's collected in the metro region. And I think that's really part of the discussion that I'm interested in having here today and going forward is what can we do here and do it in a better way to understand the community within Portland and across Oregon with respect to the LGBT population. We do a lot of reports around minority communities, racial and ethnic communities, but I've never seen any work around what does our community look like across the state, what does our community look like locally. And I think when we start to think about those things, the Williams Institute actually has put out a great policy guide around what the best practices are for asking about sexual orientation on surveys, and when you do survey design, how do you do it in a best way to capture the data in order to make it representative and reliable? So with that, I'm going to wrap up there and allow time for questions and conversations. So thank you. Yeah.
Here's Randy. So we'll have questions and we'll use the mic.
Okay. Your slide on Richard Florida's work and the cities and prosperity index, basically, I noticed it was in the high-tech communities. It was isolated to that particular cluster. Do you think those same numbers hold out across all industries, or do you think that was specific to high-tech?
Yeah, let's go back to that slide. So yeah, so that's a good point, Randy. The gay index is related to, in this graphic, the high-tech connection. But he argues in the book that, looking at the creative class, scientists, engineers, and he classifies these groups of people with bachelor's degrees that fall into these creative occupations. He argues that not only is it applicable to the high-tech industry, but it's applicable to these industries more broadly. So when we talk about educated populations that are employed in the knowledge and information economy, on balance, places that have a higher degree of percentages of population according to the gay index do better on average economically. So I'd say it's more broad than, his argument's more broad than just the gay index. It happens to be that this graphic is focusing on that. I should point out, though, that the gay index in Richard Florida's work actually only includes gay men, or men who are identifying in a relationship with another man. It does not include same-sex female households.
So I was very interested in the opposing viewpoints that you presented at the end, and the quote by Kaddour about the disproportionate burden being borne by those who don't share mainstream values, I think is very interesting. Because I think the census, the assumptions of the census are very normative. And so we have no idea how non-normative we as a population really are. And I think so much is hidden in that single people. If you live alone, counting and are single, then who knows what lies behind that. For example, I have a friend who is in a long-term, stable threesome. She and a married couple, and she lives in a mother-in-law apartment on their property. So she counts as a single woman in her own household. They count as a married couple. But this is a long-standing alternative relationship which is utterly hidden and invisible. So we think, oh, isn't this a nice, quote-unquote, normal, ordinary American setup here? No, it's as alternative as all get out. And there's no way for us, as long as we are structuring a census to only, along those normative lines, to uncover who we really are as a population, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a number of articles that have addressed that. The heteronormative aspect of the form, the erasure of difference, and being skeptical of organizations that actually use this data and celebrate the data as a way to purposefully exclude those types of individuals from the community, and what the political discourse is behind excluding and erasing that difference. Absolutely.
If you were in charge of the 2020 census, what boxes would you add?
Oh, this is the question. Well, because it's interesting. The presentation that I'm making is, very critical of the data, and my answer to the question has always been, honestly, I don't know. I see, between these two perspectives, there's a reality, and what I didn't say is actually I'm releasing a paper this spring on this, and in the paper, I really have this, I talk about the dialogue of the political reality that in the United States, you don't count until you're counted. And I understand and I'm sympathetic to that reality. But we're not counting, we're not asking people for their identity. We're imposing identity on a response that never asks any questions about how people are identifying. And the vast majority of people within the community are not in these data. So I don't think that we can continue as a community to use these data and rely on these data to talk about the community. In the same sense, I know the political reality of the census, which is they're not going to ask the question unless they have a federal mandate or reason to ask the question. And right now, there are no federal protections for LGBT people. So the census is, you know, they don't have to add the question because there's no justification from the federal government to have the data around our population. And I think that my answer to the question would be, you know, thinking about the Williams Institute piece on how we ask these questions about identity. There's ways to ask. If we want to ask about identity, there's good ways to ask about identity that allows for multiple responses and doesn't allow for erasure of difference. Do I think the Census Bureau will go there and do that? No.
I was wondering if you can talk about a little more about gentrification. I found that there's a lot of discrepancy between gay, affluent men and lesbians in terms of urban spaces. And let me just give you an example. I lived in Chelsea, New York, and I was actually surprised not to see New York in that list, where Portland was 10th. But eventually Chelsea gentrified, so Latinos were sort of pushed out. But when Chelsea was being structured to invite more affluent people, the way they urbanized it was planning to welcome gay affluent men. And if you look at what Chelsea is now, which is now the new Soho, is predominantly gay men. So I'm wondering if here, and I see this gentrifying process in the Pearl, and I live a few blocks away, so I'm wondering if the census shows any discrepancies in terms of gender within the LGBTQ community in terms of affluency and urban spaces.
So I should turn your question to Cy, because that's basically what his article was trying to address. So your question, Castell's work in the early 80s recognized this exactly what you're talking about, that the gentrification of many American cities was largely gendered with respect to gay men being segregated from lesbians. And so Castell's work and then Cy's work in the early 90s here in Portland looking at sort of space, urban space in the city, there's a lot of really, what I would say are sort of sexist inferences around lesbians and urban space of the city, that lesbians don't have place attachment to the same degree as gay men. And so to understand, you know, sort of empirical work to understand why this segregation exists and how individuals claim space. And so making those inferences from census data is very difficult. And some of the qualitative work that had been done on this had attempted to sort of shed light into it. Admittedly, that's not an area that I'm exceptionally familiar with in terms of the literature. I will say, though, that much more of the work has sort of pivoted more recently on the loss of urban space within gay and lesbian communities. So, you know, when you go to the Castro today in San Francisco, you know, it's a very, very different place than what it was in the 60s in terms of heterosexual gentrification, gay populations being gentrified out with respect to heterosexuals. I see it when I go to DC in DuPont Circle. DuPont Circle had long been one of the areas in terms of being one of the highest concentrations of gay couples. And now you're seeing, as a result of, I mean, you see more baby strollers with straight couples being in that neighborhood, and gay populations moving east and displacing African Americans in the east part of Washington, D.C. out to Maryland. So, so yeah, that's kind of how I answer the question.
So Jason, I was really interested in your response about how you would have responded to the census prior to the elimination of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and confidentiality and degrees of the closet. And when you first talked about people being fearful to answer honestly because of the issue of confidentiality, my internal thought was, well, they don't understand that the census is required to keep this information confidential for whatever it is, 73 years. So I think that's an interesting question. I mean, to what degree is some of the problem that people don't understand that the information is confidential?
And this is the thing. I know it's confidential. You know it's confidential. I work with the data every day. I know how obsessed the Bureau is about confidentiality. But the reality is, under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I was paranoid. And my husband Charles was not. But it was on my conscience that if I did something wrong and we were seen holding hands, I jeopardized his 18-year military career. And I could not live with that on my conscience. And so even though I know that confidentiality is there, I wouldn't have identified. I know it's irrational, but that's how, I mean, you know, in Tucson, we thought we were 90 miles away from the military base. We could hold hands. We held hands. Some of his base people saw us, and the rest of the weekend, I obsessed about, they're going to report us and he's going to get kicked out. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about that anymore, but it still matters in places where there's not employment protection, where there's not housing protection.
So I guess my question is there an effort on the part of the community to do that kind of education?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and there's been a number of organizations that have been involved with that, the Task Force, HRC, Human Rights Campaign, that have focused on an amazing outreach within the community in terms of getting people to identify and talking about the fact that this is confidential. What would be interesting to know would be to know what barriers they're facing in, you know, say coming to Oregon and Portland versus going to Oklahoma, in terms of the likelihood of people being willing to identify in a place where there's not housing and employment protection.
My question is kind of about budget issues around the census, because I understand the federal government or the Congress wants to cut more census questions than add them, because the purpose of the census originally was for voting purposes. And so how do we, is it in jeopardy of any of the questions that are sort of social in nature, if they don't have anything to do with voting? And maybe you can tell me if this rumor is true, they're thinking about taking the idea of marital status off of the ACS.
Yes, so there's two questions that are on the chopping block right now on the American Community Survey. One is the marriage question, which
says it doesn't have to work.
What?
You're implying that it kind of doesn't work.
Well, that's not the reason that they're considering eliminating it, but yeah. And the other question that they're considering eliminating is degree field. So if you got a bachelor's degree, what field did you get your degree in? As you might imagine, both of those are really useful data points, both in terms of marriage and degree field. And some of the work that I've done on Portlandia, that Greg Schrock and I have done, degree field is exceptionally important to know the human capital that's moving between regions and to know what the degrees are in terms of the migrants that are moving here versus those that are leaving, to compare the differences with respect to attainment and the degree. So I've written to the Bureau, and to what extent that's going to make a difference, but there's a lot of political pressure right now to remove questions that Congress people feel are beyond the purview of what the Bureau should be collecting. Now, how they pick those two questions, I don't know.
Good morning, Craig Leitz with the Queer Resource Center here on campus. So many things are coming up, but I'm particularly struck by, I think it's just the previous slide, the second quote, or maybe, yeah, so that one at the bottom, like, let's count who's actually counted. I think it ignores what I think you were alluding to throughout your presentation that connects to your final question of the institutional homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism that exists in all of our institutions, from the highest level, which you're talking about, the census data, but down to our campus, where people are asking us as staff members and the Queer Resource Center all the time, well, how many people are there on campus? How many queer folks are there? How many trans folks are there? And we have to tell them we don't know, because the institution doesn't ask. Nowhere are they asking, on even just an institutional level here at Portland State, well, do you identify as whatever? It's conversations that we're having, and we're hoping to ask that question eventually, but I think you know, your question at the end to how do we fix this, how do we do this, is we have to address that homophobia that exists from the highest levels all the way down. You know, I think we often have in Portland this sense that, you know, it's this really queer-friendly, accepting place, and everybody would want to be out and share every part of their identity, but they're coming from different places, they're facing different family situations, and so I think the question that you asked at the end is really complex in how to fix this, because there's so much homophobia to get past. Even when there are marriage laws being enacted across the country, like that doesn't eliminate the interpersonal homophobia that I experience on a daily, weekly, however often basis. And so I guess my question, after all that talking, thanks for listening everyone, is, you know, I think that there was another quote, and you were trying to highlight like where you were struck by a quote, and I think it was like racial, ethnic, and other populations was the name of the entire committee. And so I don't know if that's a recent one or like if that, so, you know, that's 2014, that's, you know, as of October, we are still other populations. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, from your perspective, where is that institutional work happening, or is that happening at all?
Within the Bureau, or?
Sure, and other places to address these concerns.
I think that, well, I'd say the Bureau has made remarkable progress recently in trying to adapt as quickly as they can. I mean, a lot of this stuff is changing very, very fast. And you know, having representation on this committee is a big deal. The Bureau really, you know, going back to the 1990 question, they kind of walked into something that they didn't anticipate, right? With respect to the fact that they never really wanted to collect data around same-sex couples. It inadvertently, they didn't think of the consequences of who would be able to identify on the question. So seeing how people are responding to that data, I think the Bureau has done a really good job of trying to put out publications and research that are presenting the caveats necessary in terms of responding to the data in a responsible way. Could they do more? Absolutely. You know, particularly when we think around this committee on the racial and ethnic sort of questions, for example. Kim Williams has written a remarkable book on this called Mark One or More, which really talks about the move by the communities of color to push for and allow for more than one race in 2000. So 2000 being the first census at which you could identify as more than one race. It took a lot of effort of communities of color organizations to meet with this committee, to go through the formal channels of bureaucracy, to get the Bureau to respond to the changing racial and ethnic composition of this country, which is a much more diverse community, and get the census to be able to respond and allow people to identify. I think we're going to have to do the same thing in the LGBT community with respect to what a lot of the communities of color did around that question in 2000, which is to get the census to continue to present caveats around the way that this data is captured, and then move to the next step, right? And whatever that next step is, if we add a question that allows people to identify, unfortunately, part of that's going to have to move through Congress in terms of there being federal protections around LGBT populations, because the Census Bureau sort of has, look, we don't have any reason to ask for the data, and if we were to ask for the data without federal protection, then there would be a situation where there'd be criticism by Congress for asking a question at which you don't need to ask a question about. So it's a really complex question. There's a lot of political realities to this, and seeing how it moves forward, I think, will be really interesting.
Jason, thanks for this presentation. It's fascinating. You used one term in here, and I would just love for you to expand on it, and it's the idea of discursive violence. And there's just so much to say about that. I wish you'd expand on that sort of academic terminology a bit.
Well, you know, it's interesting because there's a recognition in the scholarly work this data does not capture A, B, C, D, all these people. But then the justification is sort of a pragmatic justification that this is the best stuff we have. Who's ever left behind is left behind. But the political discourse of that positionality, I think, and folks have written on this, is underappreciated across the country in the more general population, as well as within the LGBT community. And it sort of underscores some of the divide within the LGBT community, which is this historical debate, which has sort of been the assimilationists, we want to be just like them, versus folks at the opposite end of the spectrum, the sort of liberationist perspective, which is we're here, we're queer, we're proud, we include everybody. And there's a political purpose, I think, maybe I'm being too cynical here, but I think there's a political purpose to leaving out that population and saying the political pragmatic approach is to move forward with what we've got. And what is, there is a fundamental violence in not seeing and representing those who don't have a voice. And we should be, as a community, encouraging and allowing for those people who live in a state where there's not protections for housing and employment, to say, these people are part of the community, they should be part of the numbers, and we should be celebrating those as part of these data. And by not doing that, it's not only irresponsible, but I do believe there's a discursive violence to doing it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think we're just sort of, we've got to pay much more attention to it and recognize the severity of what if we're going to use these data in that way, what it actually, the damage and harm it causes.
All right. Thank you, Jason. This is a very stimulating morning talk for us and stimulated a great conversation. So join me in thanking Jason for this morning's conversation.